My unfaithful wife inquired if she could dance with another man at the celebration, and I bitterly responded, "Dance with him and stay single, because I no longer desire your company." These words emerged from me with an iciness that was unfamiliar to me in a room bustling with joyous faces and lively tunes. Those words sliced through the atmosphere like a keen blade. There was a period when I unconditionally believed in the woman beside me in our partnership that appeared solid. However, that evening the facade dropped, exposing what I dreaded to acknowledge, the stark reality of a betrayal deep-rooted in the past yet casting a shadow into our present. She approached me, wearing an almost naive smile, seeking approval to dance with another man. My heart turned icy, and a surge of memories began flooding my thoughts. It seemed a harmless request, yet behind her inquiry was more than a mere wish to dance. There was a concealed narrative deeply buried in a history she never disclosed to me, a history that now unfolded quietly before me, hinted only by his evasive look and the stress lines etching his face. At that moment, a torrent of emotions overwhelmed me: jealousy, rage, betrayal. I transformed from the serene individual she recognized and the affectionate spouse I had always been. The trust that had once been the cornerstone of our relationship lay in ruins, and I realized there was no turning back. My eyes locked onto hers, searching for a truth I wished not to accept but already sensed was there, hidden among strained smiles and unspoken words. She faltered, but there was nothing left to discuss. The tension in the air was almost tangible for a moment. All eyes were on us, but it felt as if we were the only two in that space. I recognized that this dance was not merely a dance, it was the revelation of something she had concealed. Then I voiced the statement that doomed our relationship: dance with him and stay single, because I no longer desire your company. The ensuing silence was overwhelming. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sounds emerged. I didn't need to hear more, I already knew enough, perhaps even more than I should. The burden of those words was overwhelming, yet there remained mysteries beneath this act of betrayal, a secret meticulously guarded that somehow linked that night to her distant past. What was she concealing, and what did that dance truly signify? The specifics of that secret still elude me, but now all that remains is to unearth how deep this betrayal runs and what it conceals behind her simple request to dance. She's unaware, but I'm about to find out. The venue was flawlessly adorned, each element crafted to exude elegance and sophistication. The gentle lighting glimmered off the crystals in the chandeliers, while the background music set a festive tone. It was a night many anticipated, an annual affair where the tight-knit Denver community of Cherry Creek convened to dance, laugh, and momentarily set aside their daily concerns. Among the couples that were noticeable was Richard, a man with a robust and assertive demeanor whose blue eyes reflected a confidence that many esteemed, and his wife Jessica, a woman of subtle grace and an engaging smile. They appeared as the quintessential couple, the sort everyone assumed would last indefinitely. But Richard had established his life through relentless effort and determination as the proprietor of a modest construction firm. He had surmounted numerous obstacles over the years, but consistently found solace in Jessica. In turn, she possessed the knack for brightening any gathering she attended, gracious and charismatic, making her presence inevitably felt. Friends and neighbors viewed them as the perfect match. They epitomized a sturdy and prosperous union, yet as often happens in life, looks can mislead. Over the recent months, Richard perceived a subtle shift in Jessica. She became more withdrawn, seemingly always preoccupied. Discussions that once flowed effortlessly now felt strained, and their moments of closeness grew infrequent. Richard endeavored not to dwell on it too much, reassuring himself it was merely exhaustion or the strain of daily life. Nevertheless, an undeniable tension lingered in the air. Their once tranquil nights were now marred by disturbing thoughts that kept him awake, wondering if all was truly well. Conversely, Jessica found herself in a vortex of mixed feelings. She adored Richard, or so she thought, but something within her had shifted. A corner of her heart that she believed was long dormant had started to pulse vigorously again. Lately, she began reconnecting with old friends, reviving memories of carefree days before marriage, before the duties adult life imposed. Among these friends was one whose stirred emotions she assumed had faded: Michael, her first love. Unlike the steady and predictable Richard, Michael was spontaneous and bold. A chance encounter at a neighborhood cafe, after years of no contact, instantly reignited Jessica's feelings. He was no longer the unrestrained youth she remembered, yet his eyes still sparkled with allure. They conversed like old pals, laughing about past times, and this is how their seemingly innocuous friendship began to blossom. Richard remained oblivious to Jessica's renewed ties with him, absorbed in his own pursuits, perhaps weary of the monotony. He could not fathom that Jessica's history was weaving into their present, jeopardizing all they had built. He stayed dedicated to his work, convinced they could surmount any hurdle as they always had. That evening, as they prepared for the dance, Jessica was noticeably agitated. She lingered longer in front of the mirror, adjusting her dress, refining her makeup, appearing anxious. Richard, on the other hand, complimented her looks, remarking she was as lovely as ever, but his tone lacked genuine enthusiasm, a detail Jessica did not miss. She sensed something was fracturing between them, possibly beyond repair. They arrived at the event together, yet it felt as though an unseen divide separated them. Richard mingled with friends and colleagues, striving to uphold a facade of normalcy, while Jessica was absorbed in her thoughts. She noticed Michael across the room, engaging lively with the group. Their gazes met momentarily, a silent exchange, but laden with implications. A shiver of both excitement and remorse coursed through her, leaving her disoriented. As the music grew louder and couples filled the dance floor, Richard noted Jessica's unease, but chose to overlook it, not wanting to disrupt the evening. He sought a tranquil night, perhaps some enjoyment to alleviate his discomfort. Yet, Jessica harbored different intentions. Observing Michael navigate the gathering, a risky notion began to crystallize in her mind. She knew it would be a grave error, but the allure and nostalgia overwhelmed her resolve. Eventually, Jessica turned to Richard, her voice tender, and asked, "Can I dance with him?" Richard, taken aback, looked at her without immediately grasping what she was implying. Almost instinctively, he asked whom she meant. Without needing a reply, he turned his gaze to Michael, who stood discreetly on the other side of the room, observing them. It clicked instantly for Richard, and he was overwhelmed by a wave of anger and betrayal that nearly choked him. This was the night he had dreaded, the night his suspicions would be confirmed. He could have yelled, caused a commotion, but instead he replied with a chilling calm that was even more cutting. "Dance with him and stay single, because I don't want you anymore." Jessica was stunned by his response. She hadn't anticipated such an answer, and for a moment she was paralyzed, unsure of what to do next. The once lively hall seemed to freeze around them. All other sounds faded, leaving only the echo of Richard's words. But with her simple request to dance, their fates began to unravel in unexpected ways. The night was just starting, but the events that would follow were set to alter their lives forever. Feeling as though the floor had vanished beneath her, Jessica was shaken by the iciness in her husband's voice, an iciness she had never heard before. He didn't shout, nor did he display his anger through exaggerated actions, but the frosty and decisive manner in which he spoke those words struck her like a knife. Suddenly, the elegant ballroom, with its twinkling lights and soft music, turned into a nightmarish scene where the reality of her choices weighed unbearably heavy on her. She stood motionless, processing what had just occurred. Richard walked towards the bar as if he had just completed a routine transaction. Jessica, not knowing how to react, realized that her impulse to ask to dance with Michael, fueled by misguided nostalgia and the thrill of revisiting the past, had led to almost instant regret. She observed Richard from a distance, his form rigid at the bar, and felt the guilt eating away at her. All she had wanted was to experience something different, something fresh, but now everything seemed to crumble. She knew she couldn't retract her words, and the weight of her decision was starting to overwhelm her. Michael, who was a few meters away, sensed the tension. He hesitated briefly before approaching Jessica with a serious expression. "Are you okay?" he asked, genuinely concerned. He wasn't privy to the exact exchange between her and Richard, but he sensed something was amiss. Jessica forced a smile, trying to mask the turmoil inside. "Yes, I'm fine," she lied, looking away, but they both knew that was far from the truth. As the music continued and other couples danced on, oblivious to the unfolding drama, Jessica found it impossible to focus on anything. Every word, every decision she had made in recent months seemed to converge at that moment. She longed to relive the past, but in doing so, she jeopardized what she held in the present. Michael, noticing Jessica's discomfort, suggested they step outside to get some air. Desperate for an escape from the suffocating atmosphere, she agreed. Outside the hall, the crisp Colorado breeze brought some relief. They stood in silence for a few minutes, gazing up at the starry sky. Breaking the silence, Michael spoke with a low, cautious voice. You seemed distraught. What happened in there? Jessica sighed, knowing she could no longer conceal her feelings. Richard said something that changed everything, she replied, still struggling to grasp the full impact of her husband's words. I don't know what to do, Michael. I'm caught in a web of my own making. Michael, astute as ever, sensed there was more to the story, but chose to respect Jessica's need for space. However, something within him was also stirring. Ever since they reconnected, he had pondered whether things could be different, whether they could have a second chance. But seeing her in that moment of vulnerability, he realized how complex and perilous it would be to pursue that path. Yet, the prospect of rekindling something with her was tempting. Jessica felt his stare, and for the first time, questioned whether she had truly taken control of her life or was merely being swept away by her emotions. Inside the lounge, Richard felt more alert than ever, despite the whiskey he had consumed. His thoughts revolved around Jessica's words and the man he now saw as the catalyst for the downfall of his marriage. He didn't know Michael, but it didn't matter. The mere fact that Jessica had asked to dance with another man and chosen that moment to express her desire was enough to obliterate any remaining trust he had in her. Richard surveyed the people laughing and enjoying themselves and felt detached from it all. He wanted to leave, to escape the party, but something held him back. Perhaps it was the need to see what Jessica would do next, or maybe it was pride that prevented him from walking away defeated. Back outside, Jessica was about to reply to Michael when she noticed movement inside the room. Several guests began to exit, some with anxious expressions. She and Michael exchanged looks, sensing that something was about to unfold. Suddenly, the door to the hall burst open and Richard appeared. His face was tense, his eyes locked on Jessica. He approached, stopping in front of them, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Michael stepped back, uncertain of what would follow. Richard stared intently at Jessica, completely disregarding Michael's presence. I hope you're satisfied, he said, his voice laden with irony and pain. Jessica was speechless. She knew nothing she said now would alter anything. The decision was made, and the road ahead was filled with uncertainty. But what she, and no one there, knew was that the night was far from finished. Something profound and concealed was about to surface, something that would alter everyone's lives dramatically. With one final glance, Richard turned and walked away, leaving Jessica and Michael alone in the darkness. Jessica was overwhelmed by a growing distress, feeling as if the air was being sucked from her lungs. She wanted to chase after Richard, to call out, to apologize, but her legs wouldn't move. Michael, recognizing the gravity of the moment, tried to offer comfort, but knew it was beyond his control. All that was left was to wait and see what unfolded next. In the tension-filled silence that ensued, Jessica noticed something that deeply troubled her. Michael's look, once filled with affection and nostalgia, now harbored a shadow of something darker, something she had never seen before. It was the precursor to a revelation she was not ready to confront. The night still held secrets, and none of them would be easy to confront. The silence of the night settled over the Cherry Creek neighborhood as Jessica lay motionless in the darkness, the biting cold of the Colorado air seeming to freeze not only her body but her spirit. Richard's words continued to resonate in her mind, echoing like a final and unalterable decree. He, who had been her companion for years, sharing joys and sorrows, now felt like a stranger, and the man standing next to her seemed like a distorted reflection of the past. Bringing back memories that should have stayed hidden, Michael said urgently, a tone in his voice she couldn't ignore. He was now closer, his gaze intense, as if he was on the verge of disclosing something that couldn't be held back any longer. Jessica hesitated, feeling the ground beneath her feet becoming increasingly unstable. She knew this moment could not be delayed, yet she dreaded what might come next. She followed him to a dimly lit corner of the room where they were barely visible. Michael turned to her, his face serious, almost desperate. There's something you need to know, he began, and Jessica's heart raced. I'm not the same as I was before. I'm not the young man you met years ago, that naive boy who believed in happy endings. Michael, what are you trying to tell me? Jessica asked, her voice trembling, confusion and fear beginning to overwhelm her. I never stopped thinking about you, he confessed, and what should have sounded romantic instead felt like a burdensome admission. All these years, I wondered what it would be like if our lives had taken a different path. When I met you again, I saw a chance to correct a past error, to perhaps reclaim what we had left behind. But things have changed. I have changed. Jessica took a step back, the impact of his words enveloping her like a blanket of despair. Michael, we're different people now. That was a long time ago. We can't just go back, I know. He replied, more solemnly, but I'm not just talking about the two of us. There's more. There's something I need to tell you. Jessica's stomach churned. What do you mean? Richard isn't the only one with secrets, she asked, Michael's voice low and filled with emotion. And the secret I've kept all these years involves you. The air seemed to drain from Jessica's lungs, and for a moment, the world spun around her. Michael, what did you do? Her voice was a whisper, barely audible as she struggled to comprehend the unfolding situation. Michael hesitated, his eyes fixed on the ground, unable to meet Jessica's gaze. I never told you what happened after you married Richard. I never shared how it destroyed me, how I felt betrayed, not just by you but by fate. I wish things were different, but I was young, impulsive. I made mistakes. And one of those mistakes was keeping in touch with you even after you were with him. Jessica began to piece things together, but still couldn't grasp the full picture. But that was so long ago, Michael. Why does it still matter now? Because I never stopped wanting you, he admitted, finally looking up at her. I never stopped imagining us together, and I let that consume me. When we met again, I saw a chance to start anew. But I knew that to do that, I needed to remove Richard from the picture. Michael's words hit her like a physical blow, leaving Jessica speechless, her emotions swirling chaotically. Get Richard out of the way. What did you do, Michael? I knew that if I exposed our past, if I told him what really happened between us, he would never forgive you. He would leave you, and then, finally, I would have a chance to be with you, Michael confessed, the guilt evident in his voice. But I realized too late that it wasn't the same. That time had changed everything, including us. Jessica felt tears stream down her face. Did you do it out of revenge? Out of jealousy? Did you destroy my marriage over something that happened years ago? I just wanted what I thought was mine, Michael whispered, his voice cracking. You destroyed everything, Michael, she replied, shock turning to anger. You manipulated our encounters, orchestrated situations to make Richard suspicious, all to try to reclaim something that could never be restored. Michael stayed quiet, the shame evident on his face. Jessica understood he was genuine, yet that did nothing to mitigate the sting of his disclosure. At 20-30 she felt exploited, deceived in a way she never thought conceivable. What was supposed to be a fond reunion, a rekindling with an old companion, morphed into an emotional snare, meticulously orchestrated by someone she believed she recognized. The stark truth, now unveiled and harsh, shattered her. But Michael, whom she had romanticized as a lost lover, exposed himself as a man fixated on a concept that had ceased to exist. Their meeting was not coincidental, but a piece of a scheme aimed to dismantle what she and Richard had established. But anger simmered within her, intensifying uncontrollably. You manipulated our lives, Michael. You treated our emotions as pawns in your cruel game, merely to fulfill your ego, she accused. His words sliced through the tension-laden air, replete with sorrow and disillusionment. Michael had nothing more to add. The gravity of his deeds dawned on him, and he realized that regardless of tonight's outcome, he had already lost. Jessica, who he had cherished and idealized for so long, now recognized him for who he truly was, a broken man, propelled by selfish and ruinous impulses. The facade had crumbled, leaving only the harsh reality. I was mistaken, he confessed, more to himself than to her. I thought I could alter the past, that we could begin anew, but I was entirely wrong. Jessica did not reply immediately. Disappointment was deeply etched on her face, and the burden of these revelations seemed too immense to shoulder. Yet she could not remain passive, regretting the past. She needed to act, to make a choice that would shape her future. Abruptly, the lounge door swung open again, and Richard appeared at the threshold, his gaze locked on them. He had come back, not due to weakness or insecurity, but to confront Jessica one last time. The scene he had dreaded of them together was now before him, not of joy but filled with pain, anger, and something more sinister. Jessica started to speak, but Richard silenced her with a gesture. He wasn't there for excuses, he demanded answers. I've heard enough, Richard declared, his voice steady yet laden with profound sadness. I should have seen this earlier, but I was blind, misled by the illusion that you were still the woman I fell in love with. Jessica swallowed hard, feeling her words heavy with implication. She was no longer the same, and she knew it. Richard, but she faltered, unsure how to proceed. Do you have anything to say, Jessica? Richard pressed, his eyes piercing into hers. Can you at least be truthful now under the intense scrutiny? Jessica recognized that her only option was to confront the reality. I was naive, Richard. I let myself be swept away by emotions that should have remained buried. Michael shouldn't be here, he doesn't belong in our lives. I erred, but I never intended to cause you pain. Despite her admission, Richard's response was unforgiving. That doesn't change what transpired, he replied sternly. Despite everything, Jessica sensed Richard was still wounded, yet something about him suggested that perhaps, just perhaps, amends could still be made. She approached him, tears forming in her eyes. I know I hurt you, and it might be too late to seek forgiveness, but I still love you. Richard, he observed her silently for a lengthy moment, then his features softened, though the weariness and disappointment lingered. Love shouldn't be destructive, Jessica. Love shouldn't lead to ruin, he said. Michael, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. I'm responsible for this, Richard, not her. I'm the one who introduced chaos into your lives. I deceived, I lied, and I'm suffering the consequences. If anyone deserves scorn, it's me. Richard glanced at Michael, and for a moment it seemed he might lose his temper, but then he exhaled a long, deep breath. What you did is inexcusable, but that doesn't diminish her disloyalty. They both erred, and I no longer have the energy for this. Jessica's heart sank. She knew Richard was correct, the injuries were too severe. The harm inflicted couldn't simply be reversed with apologetic words. Still, she couldn't surrender so readily. Please, Richard, give me an opportunity to correct my wrongs. Richard remained quiet for a prolonged period, gazing into the void as if caught in an intense inner struggle. Eventually he faced her, and Jessica could see that the man she cherished was there, yet profoundly wounded. I don't know if I can trust you again, he stated, his voice laden with resentment. The ensuing silence was thick and stifling. The outcome was uncertain, and everyone understood that whichever route they took next, it wouldn't be straightforward. One thing was definite: the evening that began with a mere plea for a dance had spiraled into a calamity for all involved. Jessica awaited Richard's reply, feeling the heaviness of her decisions like an oppressive load. All she could now do was anticipate the judgment from the man she wronged yet still adored. Meanwhile, the brisk Colorado breeze swept by, carrying the hint of a dawn that still appeared distant. The frigid Colorado wind seemed to mirror the quietude that hung between them. Richard, Jessica, and Michael found themselves ensnared in a distressing deadlock, each grappling with their personal torments. The truth of that night's events continued to echo, leaving a vacuum where there had once been assurances. No return was possible, and what remained was to face the repercussions of his deeds. Richard, still consumed by anger and sorrow, eventually broke the silence. I don't know what to do, he confessed, his voice breaking with emotional weariness. For years he believed their union was firm, that they were unique, but now he realized they were just another couple adrift. Jessica felt the sting of his words, a blend of guilt and despair overwhelming her heart. She had always been aware that her actions would not be without repercussions, but witnessing the man she adored so devastated was more than she could handle. She acknowledged her mistake. She realized she had let the past seep into the present in a manner that was irreversible. Yet now, confronted with Richard's agony, she found herself in an ethical quandary she never anticipated facing. Richard, I know I can't alter what happened, Jessica began, her voice trembling yet resolute. But what's left now is to decide what we do moving forward. We can let tonight define everything, or we can attempt to rebuild something, albeit differently. Michael, observing the two, recognized that his part there was concluded. He had been the catalyst for everything, but now he perceived that the turmoil that ensued was beyond his control. He stepped back, realizing that his continued presence only complicated matters. I think I should leave, he murmured, trying to exit the scene with the small amount of dignity he retained. Richard cast a fleeting glance at Michael, and for a moment it seemed he might erupt in fury, but his demeanor shifted, and he simply nodded silently. Michael turned and started to walk away, his silhouette gradually disappearing into the night like a spectre from bygone days. Jessica experienced a brief respite, yet she knew the true test was just beginning. Now, devoid of Michael's influence, she and Richard needed to confront the remnants of their union. I don't know if I can forget it, Richard said, now focusing entirely on Jessica. Everything we built, everything we trusted, was shattered in just one night. How can we simply move forward? Jessica understood there was no straightforward solution to that question. She could see the chasm that was widening between them, a chasm deepened by years of neglect, unvoiced grievances, and ultimately by the disclosure of a betrayal that exposed what they both had concealed from themselves. "I don't know if we can manage it," she acknowledged, the harsh words poised on her lips. "But maybe that's what we need to determine whether it's worthwhile to try, or if we should accept that it's finished." The ethical quandary they encountered was harsh. Jessica realized there was a cost involved, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to bear it, and Richard, caught between a desire for vengeance and the affection he still harbored for her, couldn't decide whether to forgive her or punish her. "Do you still love me?" Richard asked suddenly, his question sounding more desperate than inquisitive. Jessica gazed deeply into his eyes, searching for a trace of the man she once knew, and replied with painful sincerity, "Yes, I still love you, but I know that might not suffice." Richard turned away, struggling to hold back tears. "Love is not enough," he whispered, almost to himself. "What we have now is a choice to either try again or to surrender. But if I try, Jessica, if I truly try, will you promise me you won't make the same mistake again?" Jessica felt the burden of the promise he sought. She knew making promises was one thing, but fulfilling them, given their tumultuous history, would be something else entirely. Yet, there was no alternative. "I promise," she declared with more assurance than she felt. "I know I've let you down, and I'm aware that won't change quickly, but I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to preserve what we still have." Richard remained silent, contemplating her words, absorbing the significance of her promise. What they decided next would define their future, for better or worse. They stood at the brink of a precipice, and their decision would propel them towards a new reality, ready or not. Thus, they stood together, yet distanced by a gap that might never fully close. The night was far from concluded, and what unfolded next would determine not only their marriage, but also who they would become moving forward. The choice lingered, a bridge over the gap that divided Jessica and Richard. For days they avoided each other, as if mere eye contact could reveal the truths they both still dreaded to acknowledge. Yet, there was an increasing tension in the silence, a tension that demanded resolution. They knew they couldn't continue this way indefinitely. The morning after their confrontation, Richard took the first step. He awoke before dawn, the house submerged in an uneasy quiet. Sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in his hands, he reflected on what remained of his life, with Jessica memories of years of marriage intertwined with recent sorrow, creating a turmoil of conflicting feelings. He needed clarity, something to illuminate the path forward, whether towards reconciliation or farewell. When Jessica finally descended the stairs, her gaze met Richard's, filled with both hope and apprehension. She was uncertain of what to expect, but knew she could no longer evade confronting what needed to be resolved. "We need to talk," Richard stated, his voice low but determined. Jessica nodded, and they sat opposite each other, the tension nearly tangible between them. "I've been thinking," Richard began, choosing his words with care. "We can't erase what happened, we can't pretend nothing has changed, because everything has changed. But perhaps instead of trying to rebuild something that's broken, we should ask ourselves what we truly desire moving forward." Jessica felt the impact of those words. "I know that full reconciliation is unrealistic, but the thought of a permanent split is equally frightening. I still love you, Richard, but if that's not sufficient, then perhaps it's better if we part ways." Richard gazed at her with a mixture of sorrow and comprehension. "Love isn't enough, Jessica, but what we can do is decide whether to continue trying or if we must separate to discover something we don't yet realize we need." Those words, as harsh as they were, brought unexpected clarity to both. The love they had was genuine, but the scars from their decisions made returning to their old life impossible. They recognized that often the hardest choice is also the most essential. With a heavy sigh, Jessica looked at Richard, tears in her eyes. "I think we already know the answer," she said, her voice quivering yet firm. "As much as I wish we could overcome this, perhaps it's best for both of us to part ways." Richard nodded, his sadness apparent. "I didn't want it to end this way," he whispered, "but perhaps this is necessary for us to find peace." The silence that ensued was profound yet somehow freeing. They had come to the conclusion of their journey together, and although the pain was sharp, there was also a shared recognition that it was the right moment to part. There would be no yelling, accusations, or fault-finding, just the understanding that despite everything, they both deserved a new beginning, even if not together. Over the following weeks, the process of separation was painful but surprisingly calm. They sold their home, divided their belongings, and moved forward separately. Jessica returned to Denver, seeking to rebuild her life free from the burdens of past decisions. Richard, in turn, relocated to a new city, searching for a place where he could find new purpose. As for Michael, the man who had unsettled the balance of their destinies, he vanished from their lives, driven by remorse and embarrassment over his deeds. He left without a trace, carrying the weight of his errors, hoping that time might allow him a chance to atone, away from those he had wronged. Months later, on a sunny afternoon, Jessica discovered an envelope addressed to her with no return address. Opening it, she found a letter from Michael. In it, he conveyed his remorse and acknowledged his complete responsibility, wishing her and Richard happiness, even apart. The contents of the letter didn't bring solace, but it marked the end of a painful chapter. Jessica burned the letter, letting the ashes of her past disperse in the breeze as the flames devoured Michael's words. As she watched, she realized she was finally prepared to move forward. Thus they each continued, bearing their scars, but also holding on to the hope that despite a turbulent past, the future might still offer something positive. Because sometimes the conclusion of one tale is merely the start of another.